his legs in chains. That's the opening image of Oh Brother, Where Art Thou, the first movie that we saw in this class. It's an image that you're going to see again in the movie we're watching this week, the 1960s film Spartacus, about the historic slave rebellion that occurred in Roman society from 73 to 70 BCE. The film is extremely long. It is 198 minutes in a restored version done in the 1990s. Originally, it was 184 minutes long. Spartacus is definitely a historical epic. For that reason, you may find in watching it that it suffers from some of the problems that we've talked about in historical epics. For instance, in Alexander the Great, issues of historical accuracy. There is certainly the issue of length, as occurred in Cleopatra, a film that was edited many times. Spartacus, again, is very long, and it follows a straightforward narrative, no flashbacks. It begins with Spartacus being bought. Well, he works in mines, supposedly in Libya, and he's bought by a Roman slave trader, played by Peter Ustinov, who's very, very good. I actually think that in a lot of ways he kind of ties the movie together, and he gives the movie, you'll see, a sense of humor, which is one thing I think to think about. One thing I think that often happens with these historical epics, or in talking about any kind of historical important subject, is that people take things really seriously. And sometimes that seriousness can maybe interfere with things like the storytelling. And I bring that up because apparently Stanley Kubrick, the director, who later would bring us Lolita, Dr. Strangelove, 201, Clockwork Orange, Full Metal Jacket, felt that the storytelling, the narrative in Spartacus was problematic. And even though the narrative is very, how would you say, it doesn't skip any steps, I would say it kind of plods at some times. That's my personal opinion. But again, yes, so questions of historical accuracy, and again, the issue of humor. So yes, the Peter Ustinov character, he's really quite funny sometimes, and he appears throughout the movie. And, one thing to keep in mind as you're watching it too, along with the questions of historical epic, is to think a little bit about the things we talked about tragic heroes. It's obvious that Spartacus is the hero of this movie. There's no question about it. He's played by Kirk Douglas, the father of Michael Douglas, an actor you may be more familiar with. And Kirk Douglas was a big movie star at the time the movie was made. The movie also features Laurence Olivier as Crassus, the representative of the Roman aristocracy. Spartacus is a very serious character in the movie. I feel that, to me, he suffers perhaps from, I don't know, the dangers of a Hollywood historical epic hero. He's really serious. He doesn't seem to have any hamartia, any tragic flaws. And whereas this slave trader, played by Peter Ustinov, Batiatus, has lots of flaws. So, if you're thinking about what makes a really compelling character, that's something to think about in watching this movie. Other things about Spartacus is that the movie is, it has amazing sets. There is an amazing scene where 120,000 slaves face a Roman army. The Roman army lines up, and the cinematography in this movie is also amazing. It won an Academy Award for it. You'll see why. Keep in mind the things we talked about, camera angles and, different kinds of close-ups and shots. This movie is full of that, and it's really beautiful to watch. And quincux refers to a military formation that a Roman legion would use with these 5 points. It's also actually used by the Romans in planting orchards. The quin refers to the Roman word for 5, quinque. And the battle scenes were shot in Spain in the mountains, and they are gorgeous. There's also something really in seeing this ragtag army of slaves fighting against the very well-organized, very well-dressed Roman legions. And, I think that one of the appeals of Spartacus, I think this movie was made in 1960, it's part of the civil rights movement. The movie you could say it has a manifesto-like quality. It talks about freedom and, the rights of the oppressed. And it makes that, you know, listen to those kind of pronouncements throughout the movie. So I think that's one of the signs. I actually think that's, to me, some of the biggest historical inaccuracies of this movie. You know, looking aside things like, you know, anything about that we've talked about, like the facts. Spartacus plays fast and leaves with some facts. There's a character named Gracchus. Gracchus in the movie, who is sort of he's meant to be, to be a Roman politician, or maybe a composite of two Roman politicians who were brothers, both with the last name of Gracchus, who stood up for the common people, the plebs of the Romans, around 133, 122 BCE. His name is Gracchus. The character in the movie did not exist, but he's supposed to be taking the part of the plebes, or the common people, the Roman citizens who were common people, versus the Roman citizens who were aristocrats, or belonged to what we might call the optimates, or the patrician class. The representative of this class, the aristocrats, is Crassus, Marcus Licinius Crassus, and another character we're going to have in this movie is Julius Caesar, who was a patrician by birth, but at times sided with the plebeians. In this movie, he ends up siding with Crassus, but they're politicians. They go back and forth across the line. Anyways, so the movie builds up an idea about a class society, the patricians versus the rights of the people, versus the slaves, who are this huge underclass. One thing to think about with this, the movie is, well, there's two things. First of all, very interestingly, the screenplay is by a man named Dalton Trumbull, who was a screenwriter who was one of the Hollywood 10. He was blacklisted over allegations that he was sympathetic, or he was a member of the Communist Party. And he was summoned for Congress and refused to testify. He went to prison for several months, and when he got out, he wasn't able to work in Hollywood for a very long time. Actually, Spartacus was the movie that in which, you know, it was re-announced that he had written the screenplay. So that's an interesting historical fact, especially if you think of the film's message about the rights of the common man. There are a lot of scenes, you know, in this movie which are really different from a movie like Cleopatra or Alexander the Great, you know, attempt to reconstruct the life of a slave, of a common person, of what life is like for most people in the ancient world. It's a part of ancient history that we have really very little idea about. Slaves were often illiterate, did not leave records, were not counted. Scholars, in the past 2 decades or so, scholars have become much, much more interested in studying slavery in ancient Rome. And it's well-deserved. It's very hard to find about the lives of slaves. You know, we don't know how many there were. People estimate they could have comprised as much as a third of the population of Rome. Slaves, every Roman had slaves. The poorest Roman citizen had at least one slave. Slaves, anything you do with a mechanical device, you know, brush your teeth, wash a dish, put on your clothes, write your paper. A slave would have had some part in that in the ancient world. Slaves helped to make your clothes. They helped to sew your clothes. They helped to bring in water. They cooked. They cleaned. That's what they're shown as doing in the movie. In reality, I think slaves did a lot more than even the movie suggests. So the movie definitely tries to depict that. It's a challenging thing to do, but it's something that I think that more ancient films I find is fascinating, trying to think of the lives of people whose lives are totally unrecorded. And you know, the ways that we do have representations of slaves in ancient literature are from some of the literature that I've given you to read, including comedies by 2 Roman playwrights, Plautus and Terence. They both have plays that are about brothers. And the slaves are not the main character, but they are key characters in the plays. So keep an eye out for them. The slaves play a very important role in keeping the plot going and keeping things happening. And I think that Romans were well aware of how important slaves were in their lives. I mean, also keep in mind the Athenians had slaves, the Spartans had slaves, all ancient people had slaves. Keep in mind, too, slavery in the ancient world is not about race. Slaves were people you had conquered. They might be children from poor families who had no choice but to sell their children. They might be abandoned children. Slaves were ubiquitous in the ancient world. The Roman world had some interesting, how would you say? In the Roman world, a slave could be freed, actually, in a process called manumission, which involved a ceremony in which the slave's owner laid his hand upon the head of the slave. Manus means a hand in English, in Latin, manumission. And so a slave would then become a libertus, or a freedman. For instance, the Roman poet Horace, we read one of his poems before the Greek, about Cleopatra. His father was very likely a freed slave. At one point, Horace mentions that his father worked as an auctioneer, and that would have been a profession that a former slave might have held. Or a former slave might also have, of course, held the position of a slave dealer. So looking at ancient comedies gives us some idea of what the life of a slave might be like. And Spartacus also has many scenes that, might be a little different in an epic. There are a lot of, at one point in the movie, and the movie does basically stick to historical events with some twists that are better for its plot. For instance, Spartacus was not born into slavery historically, as far as we can know from ancient sources. He was Thracian, but he was most likely a Thracian who served in the Roman army, deserted, and then was captured, and that's why he became a slave. It does seem that he was sent to a gladiatorial school, and the escape happened because he and some other slaves got knives and a cart of supplies, and for 3 years they terrorized, for certainly the patricians and the other citizens of Rome. It took the Roman politicians quite a long time to figure out what to do about Spartacus and his an army of slaves that grew and grew. At the largest point, it was 120,000 followers that Spartacus had. It's not really clear Spartacus did anything that he does in the movie as far as being a leader. He's talked about that by the Romans, but there are some other slaves. One of whom is Crixus. He has a fairly large role in the film. They might have also had leadership roles. It's not really clear how Spartacus, how the slaves organized themselves, got their supplies. We just know from, the guesses of ancient writers. And Spartacus, perhaps he did have some kind of education, because he certainly seemed to have some kind of military strategy training, or, that he was able to lead this huge army of people through many parts of southern and central Italy. Spartacus also, it seems, had some kind of plan to take a lot of his followers perhaps to Sicily, where actually other slaves had revolted. One of the reasons he didn't do that, though, was because some of the other leaders of the slaves, including Crixus, wanted to stay in Rome and continue to pillage and enrich themselves. The historical Spartacus also, the ending of the movie is completely fake. Spartacus was killed in battle, and he was most likely hacked to pieces. The movie has a very dramatic ending on purpose. I've included a webpage on our website this week, so you can look at some of the historical details and inaccuracies of the movie. But again, it's an important movie to look at for its depiction of the common people in an era when there were lots and lots of common people, and we just don't know anything about them today. I think that's one of the fundamental differences between ancient and contemporary society, is that, as much as we question democracy in our country, we live in a much more democratic society where people have many more opportunities, and hopefully there is less suffering. So enjoy Spartacus. There are a lot of great moments in this movie. Sunt Spartacus. I am Spartacus. It's definitely one to watch. And try to read as much of the comedies as you can a little bit in advance, keeping in mind that Romans definitely had, lived in close quarters with slaves. In some cases, they were their very close companions. and that some of the, when you're watching the movie, think about, what's historical 1960 and what's historical 73 BCE.